Guys, so this is the first of many JavaScript lessons that we're going to cover, and we're going to cover a lot of things about JavaScript that doesn't get talked about enough, and that's the under the hood part. Okay, so everyone talks about under the hood. What's under the hood? Like, what does that even mean? Like, what's under the hood? Nobody ever really talks about it. Like you've gone through probably so many tutorials and they say, well, this is happening in JavaScript, but you don't really have to worry about that because that just happens under the hood. And every time I hear that, it just always like it leads me wondering what's really under there, what's really happening there. So I've made I've done a lot of research and I've gone through a lot of that stuff and plus learning and years of experience, and eventually I decided, you know what, I think we need to put something out for people to know exactly what's going on under the hood and what's really happening in JavaScript when things are running. So one thing before we move forward, please, make sure you subscribe and, check that little bell under there because once you subscribe, since these tutorials are going to run somewhat in like, I can cover all of JavaScript in one video. So obviously I got to put out a few more, and this is the first of many. So if you check that bell, you'll have a notification that will tell you when the next one is coming up. So, and that's a good idea, okay? This is really important, guys. This is probably going to be the most complete JavaScript tutorial you're going to have. And it's not quite a tutorial. Let me make sure I check that, mark, whatever, check that checkbox right now. And let's talk about that for a second. This is not a tutorial. We're not going to actually build a project like in some other tutorials I've done where we actually have a website that we put out and things like that. A code along. It's not going to be a code along. Don't get me wrong. A lot of people learn by watching and doing with someone else and kind of replicating what other people are doing and then just kind of experimenting, and that's great. But in a sense, it's imitating. Okay, we're not going to imitate in this tutorial. We're actually going to learn. So there's going to be a lot of there's going to be a lot of talk. Okay, and I'll try to make it as fun as I can. I'll try not to bore you guys to death. But unfortunately, that's if you really want to learn, lessons is where it really comes from. All right, so let's not talk too much about that stuff anymore. You know what you need to do: subscribe, hit that bell button, do what you got to do. All right, now let's dive into this. So, what is JavaScript? Let's start off with what is JavaScript to even begin with. What are we dealing with here? Okay, so first of all, it's not a programming language like a lot of people will think it is. It's actually a browser interpreter. Okay, so what that means is it's not like C or C++ or Java. Okay, it's more of a scripting language that allows you to talk to the browser. Okay, so it doesn't require to be compiled like JavaScript does, for example, and it doesn't require an applet either because the browser itself is the application that will render it, that will run it, not render it, but yeah, I guess render it too, but it's what it will use as its output venue. So it talks to the browser directly, basically. Okay, so that's a good, that gets JavaScript already out of the way. And there are going to be hundreds, probably, of definitions to what JavaScript is. Okay, and you can look them all up. That was, what I just gave you was probably more like the, not textbook, but simplified version. Like if anyone asks, hey man, what's JavaScript? Boom, there. It's the quickest way to explain it. All right, so what we're going to really talk about on the part that I really want you to get out of this today is going to be the three main parts that are running behind the scenes, that are running under the hood in JavaScript. Okay, so up until this moment right now, we've talked about basically just a lot of other, stuff, but this is actually the part. This is where you actually are going to start learning something in this video. Up until this moment, you have just heard me talk. So the three main parts that we want to talk about that are inside of JavaScript are going to be the syntax parser, the lexical environment, and the execution context. Big words, but I'm going to break it down for you. Okay. So first of all, the syntax parser. Let's start with that. What is the syntax parser? So JavaScript has a section within it in its own engine, in the JavaScript engine, that is in charge of figuring out what you're writing in your code. It even makes sense. If it is even JavaScript, if it makes sense for JavaScript in JavaScript land. Okay. And that's just about as intelligent as JavaScript is ever going to get for you, okay? Because contrary to popular belief, artificial intelligence is not really intelligent. It's kind of like a, what's that word I'm looking for? But anyway, artificial intelligence is not intelligent. Just, I forget the word. Just put it in the comments. Just refresh my mind. So anyway, so yeah, so it's actually not as intelligent as you think. It's actually pretty dumb because it only will do what you are instructing it to do, specifically, line by line. And JavaScript kind of works the same way. In JavaScript, it's a synchronous language, so it will read everything line by line and in the order that it was given it to. Okay, so when you give these instructions to it, it will read and make sure that these instructions that you're giving it to are allowed to happen inside of JavaScript. They are functions and keywords and names that JavaScript even understands and can translate into its own computer language, so that the computer and can actually render it up to a browser. So that's basically the syntax parser. Okay. Now remember when I just said, if you back up a minute in the video, and I said that it's synchronous and it will read JavaScript is synchronous and it will read everything in the order that it was given to it, blah, 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 all that stuff. Well, that's what brings me on to the lexical environment. So the lexical environment of JavaScript is basically refers to the code in the file, okay, and the order and how it was written, the order that it was written. So if you have a bunch of code in there in your JavaScript file, it doesn't necessarily mean that although the JavaScript is supposed to read it in order and run it in order, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will actually run in the browser in the same exact order that you wrote it on the screen. Okay, we will cover a lot more of this eventually once we get to other parts of the next future videos about hoisting and things like that. But basically, the part under the hood that is in charge of reading or making sure which part of your content, right, that is in your code, that is in your lexical environment, right? Lexical environment means the order that your code is in, right? So which part gets run first? That's going to be your execution context. Okay, and that's the third part. The third main part of the JavaScript engine that we want to pay attention to right here. So the execution context is basically the part that makes sure that the execution stack is running the pieces of code that makes sense for it to run at that particular time together. Okay, and then once that function or that block of code is completely ran, so long as it's not interrupted by another piece of it. But if it's not interrupted, okay, like a function calling another function inside it and things like that, so as long as it's not interrupted, it will finish that function, and once that function or that block of code is done, it will fall off the stack, and once it falls off the stack, it goes down to the next one like that. But it will try to find it in the code in the order that you wrote it. So it will start from the top, it will find the first line of code and run that one. But once it runs that one, if there is an actual callback to another function that is way below, although that one way below is not in the order, in the lexical environment, in the lexical order, that it was made, it will still run that one because that's the execution context. For that to run, it makes sense that it has to go down there, find it, bring it up, run it, and then once it's finished, it falls off the stack, and then it follows back into the lexical environment, into the next line of code that made sense. Once it gets down there, it realizes that it already ran, so it will never even touch it again because it already ran it on the top. So that's basically how the executional context works. So now let's put this into a little bit easier perspective because I want to make sure that you guys get this part. This is the most important part in the entire under the hood thing, okay? And just think about it. Think about it as if you were making a lunch, okay? Imagine you making your lunch and you have your bread and meat and veggies and condiments, or you're making a burger, maybe, I don't know, making a burger, okay? And you have your meat and all that stuff in there. You have your sodas and you have your snack box there, to pick from. You have your lunchbox. You have all this stuff, right? So the way that you have it laid out on the kitchen counter, when you just grab some sodas and put it on the counter, grab the meat pack, put it on the, or the burger pack or whatever, put it on the counter, grab the bread, put it on the counter, all that stuff. The way you have it laid out on the counter, that's your lexical environment, okay? So you just basically just put it there, okay? So your counter is your file, your JavaScript file. The way that you laid out all these pieces of lunch that you're going to make, these are your blocks of code or, objects that will come up eventually. Just think of that. So these are objects that you put on there on your file. And then you are JavaScript in this moment. In this scenario, you are JavaScript. You are trying to make this lunch happen, right? And lunch is probably going to be not your program, but let's just call it program for lack of better terms. Now within this whole making lunch scenario, you have the bread part where you have to cut the bread, right? You have to grab the bread, cut the bread in order to get the bread slices that you're going to need for your sandwich. That cutting the bread part is a function, okay? It's making something happen, and it will create these things. It will return back to you these bread slices that you're going to need, right? So this is how we're going to start playing all this out. So first thing, JavaScript is going to come and see your lexical environment. It's going to see all your stuff laid out, and it's going to start by whichever one you wanted to run first. So if you're going to run the sandwich first, you're going to run the sandwich function, which means it's going to put the sandwich together. But when it gets to the sandwich function, it realizes that it has to make a call first to another function, which is cutting the bread, because the bread's not cut yet. So this is what happened in the execution context, in the global namespace. The first function that loads up from the lexical environment is going to be the make sandwich function. But that cannot finish. It has to run the sandwich, the bread slicing part first. So before it even finishes, it calls the bread slicing. Now that function stacks up on top of it, and that's the one that's going to take precedence in that execution stack. It's going to cut the bread and it's going to produce the bread. Once that bread slices are done, since this is done, it falls off the stack and it continues on that same sandwich one that were there, same sandwich function, and it's going to pick the rest of the veggies and the condiments and all that stuff. And once that's done, that's going to fall off the stack and it's going to go down to the lexical environment and follow and go to the next one, which is probably the soda selection. Maybe a conditional statement in there, whether you want a dark soda or a light soda, something like that, anything, right? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, although they kind of run in the lexical environment, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will run in that specific order. Like, for example, if the snack selection was at the beginning before the sandwich, maybe that's what it would ran first and not the sandwich one. So that's why the lexical environment matters, because that's what will tell JavaScript, I know you're going to do your own logic on what needs to be grouped together and what needs to run together. However, I kind of want the snack selection first. Okay. So So it kind of makes sense. If you want the sandwich first, make sure that your lexical environment runs for the sandwich to have, you know, prevalence, I guess. Okay. So that's all I'm going to cover for right now. I went a little further than I wanted to, but this is probably the most important part of the under the hood. Okay, so we're going to cover a lot more in the future in the next videos. You know, if you're confused about any of this that I just explained, and you have any questions, in the comments, write it all down. Don't shy on me. Just go ahead and ask, and you know, I'll hopefully be able to answer. If not, I'll do my research and bring you back whatever I can find. And you know, please subscribe, share, like, dislike. Even if you don't agree with me, that's okay. You can dislike as well. All right, and I'll see you guys in the next lesson. See ya.